there. And I'm gonna click go live. All right, so right now we are live and we just have a minute here to 12:30. And I'm gonna mute. Looks like we have 74 visitors joining us already. Thank you everybody for your patience, your flexibility, changing out with that link today. We're all learning here in this digital age. All right, so it is 12:30 on my clock, so I am going to start us off. I'm Allison Madison here with Wisconsin Saltwise, and I'd like to welcome everybody to our first ever Wisconsin Salt Awareness Week. We are really thrilled to have you joining us today to hear Hillary Dugan and Bill Hintz discuss the impacts of oversalting on our freshwater ecosystems. During their presentations, please feel free to share thoughts, questions, ideas that you have into the live stream chat, and the presenters will take your questions at the end. Before I hand it over to Hillary, I'm going to just say a huge thanks to all of the incredible Wisconsin Saltwise partners that have made our presentations possible this week. And a special Saltwise shout out to the Fund for Lake Michigan, whose generous support is going to enable us to take the Wisconsin Saltwise message statewide in 2021. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Dugan.
Great, thanks, Allison. Happy Salt Awareness Week, everyone. So yeah, I'm excited to get this week started with Bill talking about the sort of trends of freshwater salinization and what that means for ecology. So I'm going to give a kind of quick introduction to what we have seen happen in terms of freshwater salinization over the last few decades, what that might mean for the future, and then hand it over to Bill for sort of more ecosystem impacts. So let's get started. So as a lot of you are aware, if you picked up a newspaper or listened to the nightly news in the winter, the effects of road salt are starting to have an impact on the salt concentrations in a lot of our freshwater ecosystems. And this is true in Wisconsin, it's true across the state, into other regions of the Midwest. We're not alone in dealing with excess salt. And you're also probably familiar with this just by seeing excess salt out in the environment. These are pictures from a bus stop in Toronto. You know, I think we can all agree that we've seen instances of this in our daily lives where, you know, there's just sort of egregious amounts of salt put down. And, you know, at a certain point, it's not hard to assume that this is probably doing detriment to our environment. And you know, this headline I love because it makes it sound like a mystery why there might be crabs living in a river. Well, it's not really all that mysterious when you think about how much salt we're putting into these rivers. And if rivers start being more characteristic of marine environments, well, then you're going to get marine organisms living in there. And we use salt for a number of reasons. It's effective. We've proven that year after year. It's also on a large scale relatively cheap versus other alternatives. And we often think of it as natural. We, you know, mine it out of the ground, the ocean's full of it. How can it be that bad if it's a natural substance? But the downside is that anything pretty much can become bad if we use it in excess. So, you know, every ounce of salt that humans put into the environment is going to end up in our waters, whether or not that's groundwater, you know, staying in soils or going into rivers and lakes. And as a country, we put down about 23 million tons of road salt per year just onto our public roadways. That's not counting, you know, private application of parking lots and sidewalks and other salt sources from agriculture or water softening. And so when we're using millions of tons a year, putting it out in the environment, that's all of that salt is ending up in our waters. And so Wisconsin is, you know, a pretty large state geographically. We have 34,000 lane miles that the Wisconsin DOT takes care of in the winter. And they put down about 500,000 tons of road salt across the state. And, this adds up. A ton of road salt is $70, which, seems pretty cheap if you get a ton of something. But when you add that up across a winter, this accounts for about $83 million in total annual expenditures for the state of Wisconsin, just on winter road maintenance. And so while this is also, definitely an environmental problem, it also becomes an economic challenge when this number keeps going up every year. And so if we can come together and find some middle ground in terms of reducing salt, it's not only going to help the environment, it's also going to help our economy and save us money that we can then spend on other things. And so salt gets in to our fresh waters through a few different avenues, but they all kind of come back to human decision-making practices. So where do we apply road salt? How much do we apply? As our cities grow and become more urban, does that mean we have to salt more because there's more roads? We also have things like wastewater discharge. And so in the Madison area, we have a lot of water softeners. And so all of that salt is being discharged into rivers, depending on where that wastewater effluent goes. We also have some agricultural sources. And all of those salts are stored in the landscape and eventually flushed off into rivers and lakes. And this can also be impacted by weather. If we have bigger winter storms, more frequent winter storms, that might mean we end up using road salt more. Conversely, if we start seeing sort of less snow in the winter, maybe that's a good thing for trying to keep our roads clear. And these are salts have thresholds of ecological concern set by both the United States EPA and also the Wisconsin DNR. And these are numbers that I'm showing just to give you kind of a sense of what the following graphs I'm going to show you mean. But the EPA sets a chronic chloride threshold at 230 milligrams per liter of salt. And that's not very much salt. It's just basically a teaspoon of salt in a 5-gallon bucket of water. And so it doesn't take much salt at all to start polluting freshwater concentrations to concentrations at which we would be concerned about things living in that water, or conversely, people drinking that water. You can start to taste salt in water at about 250 milligrams per liter. And the results of all of these salts in the environment is that if you look at a time series like the one I'm showing here, which is 3 rivers in Milwaukee, what you can see is that in the winter, we have these large spikes in chloride concentrations, and these are directly associated with road salt runoff. If we see spikes in the winter, that is sort of a red flag for road salt inputs. And the dotted lines are showing those EPA thresholds of concern. And so while these rivers would be considered healthy with respect to chloride in the summer, in the winter, these rivers are all experiencing kind of chronic and sometimes acute chloride toxicity. And so this is happening pretty routinely every year. And so this is a concern. Likewise, this is a time series of a storm sewer here in Madison, Wisconsin. This is completely urban runoff. But I put a red dotted line at the top here, which would be the conductivity of ocean water. And you can see that in February and March, some of these runoff events are, almost halfway to being the salinity of ocean water. And so when we think about freshwater environments, we really don't want to see these kind of concentrations where they're starting to look more like brackish or even marine habitats. This is happening in our Madison lakes as well. These time series are, I think, a really good representation of the long-term increase because we actually have data going back to the 1940s. And so that's pretty rare all in all, but you can see that in the 1940s, the chloride concentrations in these lakes were pretty close to zero, actually, just a couple milligrams per liter. And over the last, going on 80 years now, these concentrations have continued to increase. And, somewhat surprisingly, maybe there have been no instances of real decrease. They've kind of showed this steady upward trajectory. And so part of our research is trying to figure out, how high can these concentrations go? And are we going to see these start to level off anytime soon? And hopefully in the future, if we improve sort of our best management practices with regards to salt, we can see these decrease. And if we look at this at a statewide perspective, I'm including Minnesota here, you can see that if we take all of our data from all the rivers and lakes across Wisconsin and Minnesota where we have data, we see a pretty clear urban footprint of salinization. When you see orange and yellow dots, these are areas of concern, and they map pretty well to our kind of our urban centers in these two states, Milwaukee, Madison, the Twin Cities. You know, and as we start to go to northern Wisconsin and northern Minnesota, we start seeing concentrations that are pretty much at natural background concentrations. And that's because they're in pretty remote environments that just don't have these, you know, big human impacts that we're seeing in the South. And this is a threat to our ecosystems and also our economies. Humans need fresh water. It is exorbitantly expensive to remove salt from water. And so if our drinking water sources start becoming salinized, that's going to have a huge fiscal impact on how we deliver water to people. And also animals need fresh water. You know, all of the native species in Wisconsin are adapted to freshwater environments. And as we start changing those habitats, we start running a risk of losing some of those species, especially ones that are really intolerant to salt concentrations. And so this is, you know, both a human problem and also an environmental problem. And it's now impacting drinking water here in Madison, and which is one of the reasons why it's, you know, maybe become more and more in the news in the last few years. But some of our drinking wells have shown increases in salt concentrations. And so this is, you know, we're seeing increasing salt in our groundwater because of that runoff from surface water from road salt into our aquifers. And the other question is, you know, how is this impacting biology? And that's a big area of research right now, trying to figure out, you know, what is happening in our aquatic ecosystems as we raise these salt concentrations. We know some species are much more tolerant than others to changing sort of background water chemistry. And so this is a big area of research that I think Bill might be talking about next. And so what's next? You know, I think this is a problem we can solve. We really need to start optimizing salt use. And I think there's a lot of great presentations coming up this week on that topic. And Wisconsin SaltWise has gone a long way to basically disseminate information on being aware of salt use and how Wisconsin can move forward in dealing with this problem. Thanks. You're muted, Allison.
Muted. Thank you. You would think you got that by now. Thank you so much, Hillary. And with that, we'll turn it over to Bill.
Okay. Thanks, Hillary, that's a great talk. And so, yeah, I'll transition into some of the ecological impacts of these road salts and freshwater ecosystems. And just to reiterate a couple of points that Hillary touched on, you know, when we think about how much road salt is applied each year, you know, if we take the size of a small kitchen table, for example, you know, we get about 3 to 18 pounds of salt per square meter. That is the size of a small kitchen table every year, and in many US states and Canada. So the amount of road salt applied is just extraordinarily high. And that goes for where I work, right? This is actually, I took these about 2 weeks ago. And while we can track, you know, municipality use, DOT use of different road salt types, typically those are tracked pretty well. One black box in the application of road de-icing salts is from private applicators. This is the practices of one private applicator here at the research center that I work at. And this was in anticipation of an ice event, kind of some freezing rain anyway. It turned out that none of this salt that was laid down went towards any de-icing. It was basically washed away because temperatures stayed about in the high 30s after this salt was applied. So it didn't even go to de-icing salt use, it basically just washed away. So as Hillary mentioned, these best management practices are really important to adopt given the rising salinity of our freshwater ecosystems. And just, we know that in Minnesota, Wisconsin, that the need for road de-icing salts is there because of our severe winters, right? But in the United States in general, 70% of the roads and 70% of the US population live in areas where snow and ice occur. So, this issue is pretty widespread. Now, given all the amount of road salts that are applied across a vast spatial extent throughout the United States, Canada, cold regions worldwide, one question that I've been trying to address over the past 6 years with a lot of different collaborators and the scientific community in general has really burgeoned, if you will, in this area of research. And that's just what are the ecological impacts once the salts contaminate a freshwater ecosystem. We know lakes, streams, wetlands are interconnected. What happens in the terrestrial environment affects the aquatic environment and vice versa. And then every organism in a freshwater ecosystem is somehow connected to another. So understanding what the direct and indirect effects of road salts are in freshwater systems and what those domino effects might be is something that I've focused on about the past 6 years. And there's been a lot of research since the mid-70s on the impacts of road salts, but it's really taken off over the last 10 or 20 years with increasing intense attention from the scientific community. So
Bill,
when
I'm
I
gonna pop
analyze,
in for just a second, Bill. We're not seeing your slides right now. I don't know if you want to share those.
oh, were they not shared? I
No,
apologize.
that's all right. We're all learning here.
Okay, it says it should be sharing now.
Yeah, you're good now, Bill.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone.
You might
So
want to
just-
just full screen it.
Yep, okay. Sorry, I thought I had shared it already. So just to reiterate where we're at, I just talked about, reiterated some of the points Hillary discussed, and then going back into how I study the impacts of road de-icing salts. Typically what we do is we set up, our Petri dishes as ecologists can be these 350-gallon mesocosms. So what we do is anywhere from, 36 to 60 some mesocosms. We typically populate these things with an experimental food web from, either a lake or a wetland. We do also conduct some stream-oriented experiments, which I'll get to a little bit later. But when we're identifying the ecological impacts of road salts, a lot of our work has been experimental, setting up these systems with populated with organisms from natural ecosystems. And so one common theme in a lot of our research is that we find that in these experimental freshwater communities from lakes and wetlands, we get an increase in algae due to the loss of zooplankton diversity and abundance. Zooplankton are those organisms in lakes and ponds that things like fish like to eat, but they also eat a lot of algae. So if you notice, if we move from the right to the left on this slide, you can kind of see the clear water phase where we have an abundance, high diversity and abundance of zooplankton. Then we move to the left, you see this kind of greenish hue. Well, in some of our high salt concentrations, we've noticed that kind of knocks out the zooplankton community, triggering this cascading effect whereby we get more algae in the water column. And so as we think about these ecological impacts, there are things we've observed, and now we need to generate, well, what could potentially be those domino effects through a freshwater food web. And so if we start at the red X here, and we knock out the zooplankton community or severely depress its abundance, its diversity, things like that, that could have a bottom-up effect. So if we move up from the red X here, planktivorous fish that feed on zooplankton, it could reduce food sources for those species, which might then reduce food resources for piscivorous fishes. That is the fish that we like to fish for. And so we really don't know what these unintended effects or what these bottom-up effects might be in freshwater ecosystems. But so if we move down from the red X, we get that algal bloom because we lose those critically important zooplankton. That algal bloom could potentially shade out the benthic environment. In clear water lakes, an increase in algae might reduce the amount of sunlight getting to the benthic environment, thereby affecting benthic organisms. And so this could be kind of a secondary effect to the direct toxic effects of road salts on benthic organisms. So just to kind of examine the effects of road salts on one benthic organism, these are called amphipods or fish food, and they serve a variety of functions in freshwater ecosystems. They're not just fish food, but they're responsible for things like nutrient cycling and so on and so forth. So in some of our research, we saw a pretty dramatic decline once we got to our highest salt treatments of amphipods. And so this noticeable decline, as we think about what that means, in freshwater ecosystems, our field work suggests that these amphipods are a highly preferred food item for fish species like yellow perch. So this is just a food web for a single species here from a lake in the Adirondack Park up in New York. And we can see, circled in red, that amphipods are a highly preferred food resource, second to only large body cladocerans of yellow perch in this lake ecosystem. So if we lose these kinds of species in our freshwater systems due to the toxic effects of road salts, what might happen, right? And so if in the no salt scenario on the left, we have kind of normal consumption, reproduction, so on and so forth under, low salt conditions. And what we're working on now is to try to model these effects, that when we see a toxic effect on a specific organism in an ecosystem, if we can identify that food web, can we then model the effects to higher level consumers or fish species that, we may like to fish for and consume? So, we have some running hypotheses and models under development that if we reduce the availability of quality food resources for things like yellow perch, will we get slower growth, smaller adults, reduced number of offspring, smaller offspring, and then, this feedback loop where we see a depression in the production of a freshwater fishery. So this is all kind of work that we've observed in our experiments, and we're kind of now trying to model the impacts through a food web. Transitioning from an invertebrate and a fish, if we see invertebrate in fishes, we also observed in some of our experimental communities a dramatic decline in macroalgae. Now, this macroalgae in the near shore zone of lakes and stuff can kind of be considered a nuisance in some lakes, but it also provides an essential habitat in a lot of different lake types, as well as wetlands. And so as we increase the road salt concentrations, we see this precipitous decline in this macroalgae species. And we don't know how other macroalgae species will respond, things like Nitella, or a wide array of macrophytes. So we've demonstrated this in this species, and whether this occurs on a much larger scale remains to be investigated. And there's some good studies underway now looking at this. So if we lose this habitat type, that could expose invertebrates and young fish to predators, higher predation, therefore reducing their abundance, potentially having a negative feedback loop on the consumers. So we need to think about all these indirect effects and unintended consequences when examining the impacts of road de-icing salts. Transitioning a bit into some stream organisms, we've conducted some experiments on the effects of different road salt types on rainbow trout growth. This was one experiment where we looked at 3 different salt types, that is calcium chloride, magnesium chloride, and sodium chloride being the most commonly used de-icer around the globe. When we expose rainbow trout alevins, that is that young stage you see in the center picture there, for 25 days to elevated salt concentrations, we see a dramatic reduction in growth just over a 25-day time period. And you can see that in the picture on the far right. The top fish was grown under high salt conditions, environmentally relevant conditions. Typically, I think that was about 860 to 1500 milligrams of chloride per liter, the fish in the top, and then the bottom one was grown under no salt conditions. So we see an immediate effect of environmentally relevant concentrations of de-icing salts in these streams on rainbow trout growth after just a short period of time. And so that begs the question, well, what will, could, or has happened over the long term to our freshwater fisheries? And then that question remains to be answered, but you could imagine that these organisms, if they do spawn successfully in a stream and it's, intensely salinized and we get, successful hatch, the growth may be reduced, and how this transitions into the adult stages, we don't yet know. But after the 25 days, it's pretty noticeable decline. So, as Hillary mentioned, there's this immediate need to adopt best management practices. I won't go through all these here on the right, but road salts, they keep you safe, me safe, our family and friends safe, during kind of dangerous driving conditions in the wintertime, and they reduce accident rates by up to 87% on our roadway systems. And so while the ecological impacts can be severe, and a lot of the work that Hillary's published is showing these intense, high concentrations among freshwater ecosystems, we really need to think about best management practices. And I think some others will touch on this later in the week. But yeah, I don't know if we can live without them. We may need alternatives, perhaps sand. I don't know how much better that is for freshwater ecosystems, but adopting these practices to reduce the salt loading is critically important. And so I would just like to say, a lot of the research that I presented here today, it was a team effort. And I owe thanks to many people for their efforts on some of these projects. But with that, I'll take any questions, and I apologize again for the first few slides not showing up. So thank you.
Bill, you were great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Hillary, for your dedicated research and for taking the time to share those findings with us today. So it looks like Hillary already responded to one question in the chat, just remarking that the elevated chloride concentrations that we see in the Madison Lakes are with us year round right now. And I see another question just came in, looks like maybe for Bill. Would you consider macroalgae beneficial? If so, how can the average person identify this and not confuse it with cyanobacteria?
Yeah, so the macroalgae that was in that we had in our experiments wasn't, it can be indicative of eutrophication and higher nutrient concentrations in some lakes, but not all aquatic plants and algae are bad, right? Macrophyte beds so it's kind of context dependent, but I think what the message we're trying to convey with those data is, will other species that we want in these lakes that help provide refugia for different organisms or help promote productivity in aquatic ecosystems, will they respond the same way? And we just don't know. But I think generally there's kind of a dislike. The algae we had in our tanks wasn't close to being a harmful algae in any way, shape, or form. It's associated with higher nutrient lakes, but it's not detrimental to the system in any way. But if a lot of algal species, important species like Nitella or other macrophytes might respond similarly, that's fairly concerning.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It looks like we have another comment in the chat from John J. It says, best management practices can slow the rate of growth in salt use, but do not generally reduce salt loading.
Yeah, I
think you want to take that, Hillary?
I can start with that. Yeah. So, when we say salt loading, we mean, all the salt that's coming into a freshwater environment. And so if we have management practices that reduce salt use, it will reduce the load coming into rivers and lakes. And so one, big, I think, switch that we're seeing, at least in Wisconsin right now, is the switch from rock salt application on roads to a liquid brine application. And that's been a really big push by the Wisconsin DOT. And in states that in counties that are on the forefront of that implementation, they're seeing reductions up to 50% in their salt use in the winter. And so if we can reduce public road salt use by 50%, that will go a long way to reducing the salt that's going into rivers and lakes, and hopefully bring the concentrations of some of those kind of areas of, or systems of concern down. And so that's something that, we're monitoring pretty closely. And I think we'll see the impacts of hopefully in the next, few years as we start seeing counties really drastically reduce salt use in some cases. Just speaking to what Bill said about road salt keeps us safe and there's probably some middle ground. That's what we're seeing right now is that we can cut road salt use by half and still have the same level of service that we're used to. And so that's where we're starting. And I think, building on that in the future to even reduce it more and more.
Yeah, thank you, Hillary. To piggyback off that, I would say I even got some data from the DOT and some other municipalities in Wisconsin that have cut salt use by even up to 70% while still maintaining great roads for public safety. So SaltWise is definitely a proponent of public safety. We just want to be thinking about how much salt is needed to do that. So I see a lot of comments coming in here in the chat. It looks like Eric Olson is asking, are there places in the US or the world, quote, further along in salinization where we can learn from?
Yeah, the answer is yes. There's definitely regions of the world that have sort of a similar climate and don't use the same amount of road deicer that the United States and Canada does. The problem is that at this point, we're kind of reliant on it and we've come to expect a certain level of service in our winter roads. And so, there's other countries where there's not that expectation of having, really clear roads in the world. And so for us to suddenly implement that would be probably catastrophic, to be honest. But, I think we should look at these places and think about, we live in states that have winter and have snowstorms, and how do we adapt to that in a way that's more environmentally protective? And maybe this year, where we're all getting used to doing things online, is a good first step in saying, maybe if there's a major snowstorm, we just work online that day and not have to commute during 7 inches of snow. And so I think we're starting to come up with ways that we maybe can adapt to winter conditions in a way that doesn't require pumping tons of salt on immediately. Bill probably has some opinion on that too.
Yeah, no, I think there's other types of salinization too. I think that we can learn from. There's mining. There's seawater intrusion, and a lot of this research has shown substantial changes in ecological communities, ecosystem function from that salinization. And I think really what's unique to the road salt issue is that, as Hillary showed, these freshwater ecosystems are just extraordinarily low in any salts, right? So throughout evolutionary history, you got to imagine that these freshwater organisms, haven't seen salt in their recent evolutionary history. And now we're all of a sudden on a wide scale salting these systems. So while we can learn from different types of salinization, a lot of times there's this context dependence on, what kind of salinity has the system previously encountered, what salt types are going in, because the response can vary by salt type and concentration quite a bit. So.
All right. It looks like, Bill, there's another question coming your way from Nick, who asked, in the trout experiment, did you run other concentrations, and was the growth retardation dose dependent?
Yeah, so what we found, so I mentioned we had the 3 salt types, and then we did 5 total concentrations, including the control. And what we found is that the concentration at which an effect occurred started at that acute concentration, the 860 that Hillary described, that the United States EPA sent. And so it started much lower for calcium chloride than it did for something like sodium chloride. So calcium chloride is becoming a common alternative to sodium chloride because it works better at lower temperatures, right? And so, but in that experiment, we actually saw, I should have shown the Uber figure, if you will, the paper illustrates it, but it was dependent on type and concentration. So it's the context dependent effects of road salts can kind of for me, you know, we really rack our brains about, well, what salt type, what concentration, what organism. You know, rainbow trout are Pacific salmonid, technically. They're in the genus Oncorhynchus, right? You would expect them to be fairly salt tolerant. But before those organ systems that handle high salt concentration develop, that's kind of our running hypothesis about why we saw those negative effects on growth. It's just osmotic stress that didn't have the physiological machinery at those young stages to handle high salt environments. But yeah, I get off that topic for a second, sorry. Once you get me going, I won't stop, sorry.
That's all right. And looks like we do have quite a few questions. So Bill and Hillary, as long as you're able to stick on here and ask these questions, I'll keep reading them. We have a question about the DNR involvement in this issue. Sounds like Hillary, that might be for you.
So the DNR is in charge of permitting and will be the agency granting variances, especially for wastewater discharge. So, they're monitoring impaired streams and rivers. And so chloride is listed as a pollutant on their 303D listing. And so you can look at the rivers in Wisconsin that are, considered impaired by the DNR. So those will be being monitored more frequently. There's a number of wastewater treatment plants that have, variances for chloride discharges, which mean their effluent is above what the EPA thresholds are. And so those are, treatment plants aren't removing chloride. So all they can really do is kind of like try their best to keep it low, but especially in cities with water softeners, as Madison's really familiar with, that's nearly impossible. And so there's, the DNR's involved with the EPA in terms of, granting those as well. Then, there's a lot of other both countywide agencies and the Department of Transportation who are, really interested in salt reduction. You can see from the DOT's point of view, if they can reduce salt use, they'll save millions of dollars. And so there's a lot of, public agencies that are interested in this problem.
Thank you, Hillary. I think you actually took on 2 questions with that. So thanks for keeping an eye on the chat as well. Yes, and I would chime in that a big part of Saltwise being what it is here is because of the Madison Metropolitan Wastewater Treatment Plant, who struggles to hit the chloride, stay below the chloride limits. They have a variance to discharge above that because, like most wastewater treatment plants, they cannot remove chloride, they cannot remove salts from the wastewater. So all the salt we put in our water softeners, they end up discharging with wastewater into streams, and any road salt that ends up infiltrating into the sewer lines also gets discharged into streams as well. So since they can't really fight it on the back end, they're trying to prevent it from entering their system in the first place. It looks like we have a question on beet juice. Would either of you like to take that on?
Yeah, I put an answer in the chat for that one too, but it's good. Beet juice is good at making road salt stick to roads, and that's primarily why it's used. It's just like for its stickiness, and so lots of places use it in small quantities as an additive. It by itself, if you use too much of it, has problems for biological oxygen demand because it's an organic substance, and so microbes are going to eat it and cause some other problems. So it's used pretty sparsely in a lot of cases. But it is something that people keep on hand, and a lot of DOT shops will have like a tank of beet juice around.
Thank you, Hillary. You're too quick for me, but I think it's worthwhile to share that one out because we get a lot of questions about beet juice, and just because things are organic doesn't mean they don't have impacts. Looks like we have a question from Fox River. Is there any research out there that shows how a community can either stop or even reverse the chloride trends in a lake?
I picture this being asked by the actual Fox River, which probably would be concerned about itself. Bill, do you have any great examples?
I think, are we, in terms of best management practices, I mean, reducing chloride loading, I think Was that the question?
The question was how a community, is there any research that shows communities that have reversed the chloride trends?
Yeah, I mean, reversing them, I don't know, decreasing them. I think there's a success story. It eludes me right now in the Chicago metropolitan area. I believe there's a few, I mean, nonprofit agencies, all around. I think even the Toledo metropolitan area where I'm at, we're starting to get into these best management practices. I don't know of too many stories about where we've seen dramatic reductions in chloride, as one viewer mentioned earlier. I mean, it takes a while for these things to flush out, right? I mean, they enter our groundwaters, they enter the hyperrheic zone, in a stream, and they can be persistent for quite a while, depending on system turnover. So I'm not aware of a reversal of trends, a dampening of the increase, sure, but I don't know, Hillary, if you've seen anything or not on that.
Yeah, so I think, one place that has had some successes is the Twin Cities, primarily because they have very, very high salt concentrations in a lot of their urban lakes. Yep. They have a lot of lakes and they're quite small, and so they're sort of easily polluted. They're also the confluence of a couple of major interstates. So I think the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency was kind of on the forefront in terms of state agencies in thinking about salt reduction. And so they've seen decreases in their lakes, although they're still sort of a lot higher than they naturally would be in that, just because they're like in such a dense urban environment. But there's a lot of work being done at the municipal scale, especially with streets divisions. And so I think Madison's a good example where they completely stopped salting kind of the smaller roads and just salt major arterials and bus routes. And, that does mean they get a lot of angry phone calls every time it snows. But, they're trying really hard to, promote some of those management practices that we've been talking about. And I think, we'll see the result of that. But it does take, as the person who asked the question said, it is a community effort. Like if you want your streets division to stop salting so much, they have to have public support in that endeavor. And, often that is hard to switch just because we've most of us have spent our entire lives, being used to having a certain level of kind of winter snow removal and salting on our roads. And so I think it's going to take just a while to get public opinion to switch to where, we prioritize things like highways and bus routes, and we really start minimizing salt on, parking lots. Like, does the entire Menards parking lot have to be salted? Probably not. But that's where we're at right now. So I think there's kind of ways of doing that, and especially thinking about commercial properties and salt use and liability and policy and these things that get really kind of complicated. But there's a lot of people doing some interesting work on all of those fronts.
It'll be great to see how some of these efforts really prove to be highly successful. I think this will be these case studies, if you will, of salt reduction. It's good indicators of success so far, from what I've seen anyway, like in New York and stuff. So.
All right, it looks like we have one last question that came in here from the Lake Maxinkuckee Environmental Fund. We went from a river to a lake. Is there an easy, inexpensive way for a nonprofit to monitor salt levels?
So the one thing that I've found in the last couple of years that has been interesting is the Isaac Walton League of America has funded this winter salt watch, which sends out free salt test strips. And so that's something that you can just sign up for free online, and they mail you a package. And they're a nonprofit and have had, I guess, some funding, which is awesome. And they seem to be sending it out kind of across the country. So that's something I would look into. And I can post that link in the chat as well.
Yeah, there's some things like a salt pen you can get on Amazon.com too that are, about 20, 30 bucks. They measure salinity. They won't measure chloride specifically, but they'll measure total salinity. These things they're pretty cheap, just battery operated. It'll give you a PPT or ppm of salinity. When you try to target chloride specifically, those probes can get fairly expensive, but yeah.
You can taste it.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, huge thanks, Bill, Hillary. Thank you so much for your time. And like I said, for your dedicated research into really answering these questions. So I know that you both are continuing to publish. Bill, thank you for sharing that best management practices that I think is in a just really recently accepted manuscript that's about to go out for print.
Yeah, it's a paper. Yeah, just a
paper. So yeah, so thank you for continuing this work. And yeah, we look forward to many of you joining us later on this week as we hear more about what communities are doing and how you can be a part of that. So.
Thanks. Sorry for the mix up on the slides. See you, Hillary.
Yep.
Thanks again, Allison.
Thank you.